In the winter of 1811, the American West did not just tremble, it broke. Imagine a world where the earth beneath your feet liquefies like water, where the mighty Mississippi River, the lifeblood of a continent, stops, churns, and decides to flow upstream. Deep in the heart of the Missouri Territory, the ground cracked open to vomit prehistoric coal and sulfurous steam, swallowing entire forests whole. This isn't a myth of the ancient world. This is the forgotten apocalypse of the American frontier, a time when the stars seemed to fall and the very geography of a nation was rewritten in a single, terrifying night. Chapter 1. The Gathering Shadows. The year was 1811. To the sophisticated elites in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, the West was a dark, tangled mystery of cypress swamps and endless hardwood forests. But for the settlers, traders, and indigenous nations like the Shawnee and Chickasaw, the frontier was a place of vibrant, brutal life. The air that December was unnaturally heavy. Old-timers in the village of New Madrid, a bustling river port on the edge of the Spanish-claimed wilderness, noted that the animals were acting touched. Dogs howled at empty horizons, cattle refused to graze, huddled together in shivering masses. Even the birds had gone silent, as if the atmosphere itself had lost its breath. Among those watching was Nicholas Roosevelt, an ancestor of future presidents, who was currently piloting the New Orleans, the first steamboat to ever attempt a voyage down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. It was a marvel of the modern age, a fire-breathing beast of iron and wood. But as Roosevelt steered his vessel toward the deep south, he felt a vibration that didn't come from his engines. It was a low-frequency hum, a tectonic warning that resonated in the marrow of his bones. The first shock. At 2:15 a.m. on December 16th, the world ended for the people of New Madrid. There was no gradual shaking. There was only a roar, a sound described by survivors as 1,000 cannons firing at once, or the shrieking of 1,000,000,000 demons. In an instant, the solid earth became a fluid. This was the phenomenon of soil liquefaction. Cabin walls, hand-hewn from massive oak logs, didn't just collapse, they were shredded. Farmers were thrown from their beds into a pitch-black darkness thick with the smell of rotten eggs, hydrogen sulfide gas escaping from deep within the crust. As they stumbled outside, they found the ground waving like the surface of the sea. Fissures, some miles long, ripped across the landscape. The earth rose and fell as the waves of the ocean, one survivor wrote in a letter that would later haunt the East Coast. The surface burst, and huge volumes of water, sand, and charcoal were blown as high as the tops of the trees. The river's rebellion. But the most impossible event was happening on the water. The Mississippi River, the gargantuan artery of North America, was being tortured by the shifting faults of the Reelfoot Rift. The riverbed rose. Islands that had been landmarks for decades simply vanished, sucked into the maw of the earth. In other places, the ground warped upward, creating temporary dams. For several hours, the current of the Mississippi actually reversed. To the boatmen moored along the banks, it looked as if the world was being sucked back toward its source. Thousands of trees, snapped like toothpicks, were swept upstream, crashing into the hulls of flatboats and keelboats. In the chaos, a new lake was born. The forest was flooded as the land sank, creating what we know now as Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, a sunken forest where the tops of dead cypress trees still poke through the water like skeletal fingers, a permanent monument to the night the earth forgot its place. The historical significance. This wasn't just a local tremor. This was a series of 3 major quakes and thousands of aftershocks that lasted until 1812. The reach. The shocks were so powerful they rang church bells in Boston, thousands of miles away. The politics. It happened just as the United States was on the brink of the War of 1812. Many saw it as a divine omen. The prophet.
The Shawnee leader Tecumseh had supposedly predicted the event, using the Big Shake to galvanize a pan-Indian alliance against American expansion.
Chapter 2: The Fire Ship on the Boiling River. While the settlers on land were fleeing into the woods to escape the opening fissures, Nicholas Roosevelt, his pregnant wife Lydia, and their small crew were trapped on the water. To the Chickasaw and Choctaw people watching from the bluffs, the New Orleans looked like a dark omen, a fire ship coughing black smoke, moving against the current of a river that was itself behaving unnaturally. On the night of the Second Great Shock, January 23, 1812, the river became a labyrinth. The Mississippi didn't just shake, it reconfigured. Navigation charts that had been used for decades were suddenly useless. Where there had been deep channels, there were now sandbars. Where there had been massive islands, there was only churning, brown water. The Ghost of Island 94. One evening, the crew of the New Orleans tied their vessel to the shore of a large, stable-looking island known to river pilots as Island 94. They went to sleep to the rhythmic slapping of the waves. They awoke to a sound like a submarine explosion. When Nicholas Roosevelt stepped onto the deck at dawn, Island 94 was gone. The entire landmass, along with the heavy iron cables they had used to moor the boat, had been swallowed by the river during a midnight tremor. The boat was floating in open water surrounded by the tangled wreckage of ancient forests that had been coughed up from the riverbed. The water was no longer liquid, it was a slurry of mud, dead animals, and shattered flatboats. Chapter 3: The Prophet's Warning. 500 miles to the north, the earthquakes were being interpreted not as geological events, but as a divine call to arms. The great Shawnee leader Tecumseh had spent months traveling through the South, trying to unite the disparate tribes into a single confederacy to stop American westward expansion. According to legend, when the tribes in the South hesitated, Tecumseh issued a chilling ultimatum. "I go now to Detroit. When I arrive there, I will stamp my foot on the earth and shake down every house in New Madrid." When the December 16th quake struck, exactly when Tecumseh was said to have reached his destination, the effect was electric. Thousands of warriors believed the Great Spirit was speaking. The Big Shake became the catalyst for one of the most significant indigenous uprisings in American history, turning a natural disaster into a geopolitical powder keg. Chapter 4: The Philadelphia Response. As the news slowly trickled east, carried by exhausted riders and mud-stained letters, the civilized world was skeptical. In 1812, there was no theory of plate tectonics. People believed earthquakes were caused by electric fluid in the air or internal fires deep within the earth. Thomas Jefferson, sitting in Monticello, recorded the tremors in his weather diary. In Washington, the government was paralyzed. They were preparing for war with Great Britain, yet they were receiving reports that their western frontier was literally sinking into the sea. This led to the New Madrid Relief Act of 1815, the first ever example of federal disaster relief in United States history. It was a messy, corrupt process where land speculators swindled the actual victims out of their earthquake certificates, but it set the precedent for how the U.S. government would handle catastrophes for the next 2 centuries. The magnitude of the unseen. To put this in perspective for a modern audience, the New Madrid sequence involved 3 shocks with estimated magnitudes of 7.5 to 8.0. The comparison, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake was a 7.9. The geology.
Because the bedrock in the eastern U.S. is older, harder, and colder than the softer rock in California, the seismic waves traveled much further. They didn't just shake the local area, they vibrated the entire North American plate. The final great shock. The climax of the saga occurred on February 7, 1812. This was the hard shock, the most powerful of the series. This was the moment the town of New Madrid finally surrendered to the river. The banks collapsed in segments the size of city blocks. The town's graveyard was dumped into the Mississippi, sending coffins bobbing downstream in a macabre parade. But through the smoke and the falling trees, the New Orleans steamboat kept moving. Against all odds, Roosevelt steered the fire ship through the shifting apocalypse and eventually reached the port of New Orleans. He had survived the birth of a new world, proving that steam power could conquer even a river that tried to flow backward.
Chapter 5: The Geysers of the Deep. While Nicholas Roosevelt and the New Orleans limped toward the Gulf, the residents who remained in the Missouri Territory faced a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. This was the era of the sand blows. Because the water table was so high near the Mississippi, the immense pressure of the tectonic plates grinding together turned the underground water into a high-pressure hydraulic system. Massive geysers of white sand and ancient liquefied coal blasted through the topsoil. Quote, "The air grew dark with a sulfurous vapor," wrote Eliza Bryan, a resident of New Madrid. "The earth opened in wide mouth-like fissures, vomiting forth sand and water until the whole country was an inundated marsh." End quote. To this day, if you fly over the boot heel of Missouri or parts of Arkansas, you can still see the sand scatters, vast pale circles in the dark, rich soil. They are the scars of 1812, silent witnesses to a time when the earth literally exhaled its internal pressure. Chapter 6: The Ghost of the Frontier. By March 1812, the Big Shake had quieted to a series of daily tremors, but the psychological damage was done. The town of New Madrid, once the crown jewel of the Spanish and then American frontier, was a ghost of its former self. Most of the original town site now lay at the bottom of the Mississippi River. But as the physical shaking stopped, the political shaking began. In Washington, D.C., the federal government was facing a crisis. This was the first time the young United States had to deal with a large-scale natural disaster. How do you help citizens who have lost everything when there are no railroads, no telegraphs, and a war with Great Britain is looming? The birth of disaster relief and corruption. In 1815, Congress passed the New Madrid Relief Act. It allowed anyone whose land had been materially injured by the earthquakes to trade their ruined acreage for fresh, federally owned land elsewhere. It sounded noble. In practice, it was the first great American land scam. The hustle. Speculators from St. Louis and Philadelphia rode into the devastated regions on horseback. They reached the traumatized farmers before the news of the act did. The sting. They bought worthless earthquake-shattered land for pennies on the dollar. The result? When the farmers later found out they could have traded that land for prime real estate, it was too late. The earthquake certificates became a form of currency for the wealthy, fueled by the misery of the frontier. Chapter 7: Tecumseh's Last Stand. The earthquakes had provided the divine sign Tecumseh needed. By the spring of 1812, the frontier was a war zone. The Shawnee leader's prophecy had come true in the most terrifying way possible, and his followers were convinced that the Great Spirit wanted the white settlers gone. As the War of 1812 officially broke out between the U.S. and Britain, Tecumseh allied his confederacy with the British. The Big Shake had effectively militarized the entire Mississippi Valley. For the next 2 years, the tremors of war replaced the tremors of the earth. But the earth had one last trick.
The very geography the quakes had created, the new swamps, the impassable thickets, and the diverted river channels made it incredibly difficult for large armies to move. The sunken lands created by the quakes became a natural fortress, hiding guerrilla fighters and displaced families alike. Chapter 8: The Legacy in the Rock. We often think of 1812 as the year of the Star-Spangled Banner or the burning of the White House, but for the people of the West, it was the year the world broke. The New Madrid seismic sound remains one of the most dangerous fault lines in the world today. Unlike the San Andreas Fault in California, which is a transform fault where plates slide past each other, the New Madrid sits in the middle of a plate. It is a failed rift, a place where the continent tried to pull itself apart hundreds of millions of years ago and failed. The 1811 to 1812 event proved that the center of the country is not stable, it is merely sleeping. Epilogue: The river remembers. Today, the Mississippi flows calmly past the rebuilt town of New Madrid, but beneath the mud and the catfish, the skeletons of the 1811 forests still stand. If you dive deep enough into Reelfoot Lake, you can touch the trunks of trees that were upright and green when the river decided to flow backward. The Great Shake didn't just move dirt, it moved the American soul. It taught a young, arrogant nation that nature doesn't care about borders, manifest destiny, or steamboats. Sometimes the earth just needs to breathe, and when it does, everything we've built is just dust in the wind.